I was sitting in a quiet, high-end coffee shop in downtown Philadelphia, staring blindly at an age-progressed photo of my missing son, when the man sitting across from me shattered my reality. He looked at the picture, then looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You are still looking for him." Before I could even ask who he was, he set a thick manila folder down on the table. He leaned in and whispered, "Everything about the kidnapping 30 years ago is right in here." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I asked him how he could possibly know anything about it. He did not blink. He simply said, "Because I am the kid in that photo. Conrad Harwick, that is my name. 70 years old, and every one of those years has been poured into erecting a logistics and real estate empire out of nothing at all. Power is something I understand intimately. The shipping routes running up and down the eastern seaboard answer to me. Thousands of people draw a paycheck because of decisions I make. Inside glass-walled boardrooms, a single stroke of my pen can redirect millions of dollars. Yet all that reach, all that authority built across a lifetime, none of it gave me even the faintest grip on the one thing I actually cared about. My youngest boy, Eli. 30 years back, when Eli was no more than 4 years old, he disappeared without a trace on a family weekend trip. He was there, and then he simply was not. Law enforcement combed through the case for months. We brought in the sharpest private investigators money could find. I threw millions at media exposure and reward offers, desperate for anyone to surface even a fragment of a lead. Every avenue dried up. My wife Miriam was crushed in a way I have no adequate words for. She moved through the following years in a fog of medication, hollowed out by the loss of her child. Garrett, our elder son, 38, now, and the chief financial officer of my company, came of age entirely inside that grief. I threw myself into constructing a comfortable life for Miriam and Garrett, trying to paper over a wound that could not be papered over. Sandra, my daughter-in-law, wants for nothing, because I made a private vow that no one under my roof would ever suffer want again. But you cannot buy your way out of that kind of sorrow. It does not leave. It only waits. Each year when Eli's birthday arrives, the investigation agency I keep on retainer delivers a new age-progressed image, software-generated, showing what my son's face might look like today at 34. That was the photograph I had in my hands that afternoon. Outside, rain drove hard against the cafe's broad windows. The air smelled of dark roast coffee and wet wool. I had drifted somewhere far inside myself, fingertips moving across the printed contours of a face I had never watched, grow up turning over the same two questions I had carried for 30 years. Where was he, and was he still breathing? Then a chair dragged sharply across the floorboards. I raised my eyes, irritated at being pulled back. A stranger had settled himself across from me, broad through the shoulders, solidly built, wearing a heavy waxed cotton jacket that dripped with rainwater. His face was weathered and hard-etched by years that had clearly not been easy. Mid-30s by the look of him. I drew breath to inform him the seat was not available, but something locked the words before they reached my mouth. His eyes were fixed on the photograph still held between my fingers. Then he said the thing that knocked the air clean out of me. He told me he was Eli. He told me he was the boy in that image. The entire room seemed to contract in that instant. The espresso machine's low hiss, the murmur of strangers at nearby tables, the rain ticking against the glass, every sound collapsed into absolute silence. Welcome back to Dadrevenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we go any further, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Just a quick one when you sense something is deeply wrong inside your own family. Do you confront it head-on? Or do you quietly gather your proof first? Drop your answer below. Now, a note before we begin: this story contains dramatized elements added to bring the narrative to life. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental, but the truth at the heart of it is what I want you to carry with you. I studied his face with a desperate intensity, scanning his jawline, the set of his nose, the depth of his eyes, hunting for some trace of Miriam, some echo of myself. My hands had begun to tremble. After 30 years of agonizing dead ends, after countless nights of waking drenched in cold sweat, could it actually be true? Was my boy genuinely seated across from me? A wave of emotion surged through my chest so violently it nearly took me off my feet. Tears pressed hard at the backs of my eyes. I stretched my shaking hand across the small table. Every instinct I had wanted to cup his face in my palms, to drag him into my arms, and hold on, and never release him. I needed him to know his father had never once stopped searching. That hope had never fully died in me. But as my hand reached toward him, he shifted back in his chair. He pulled away from my touch entirely. His eyes were flat cold and calculating, carrying no warmth whatsoever. "I am not here for a sweet family reunion, Conrad," he said, his voice hard as poured concrete. He did not call me Dad. He called me Conrad. The chill buried in those words landed like ice water thrown straight at my face. I withdrew my hand, thrown off balance, a sudden wariness tightening inside me. I pressed him. Where had he been all this time? Who had taken him? Why was he coming at me like this? He brushed every question aside. Instead, his fingers tapped the thick manila folder sitting between us. "I have the answers," he said. "I have the names. I know exactly what happened the day I disappeared, but I am not giving it to you out of the goodness of my heart. I want $2 million in cash, unmarked bills." I settled back in my seat, the breath knocked out of me. My own son, or whoever this man was claiming to be, was sitting there extorting me across a cafe table. Decades of hardened business instincts surged forward, cutting through the emotion like a blade. The desperation receded, and suspicion moved in to replace it. I told him plainly that I was no one's fool. Over the past 30 years, I had dealt with dozens of con artists who stepped forward claiming to be Eli, every one of them angling for my money. I wanted proof. A DNA test, not a single dollar before that happened. He let out a short laugh with no humor in it, no sign of being rattled. He radiated a quiet, unmovable confidence. "You want proof," he said, keeping his voice low. He unzipped his jacket, flipped open the manila folder, and moved past the stacked photographs and typed pages without a glance. From inside the folder, he drew out a single sheet of paper, sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, and pushed it across the table to me. "You think some random kidnapper just grabbed me out of a crowded park?" he asked, his voice soaked in venom. "Look at the document, Conrad. Tell me what you see." My fingers were unsteady as I lifted my reading glasses into place. I looked down. It was a banking record, old, physical, confidential. A cash withdrawal slip drawn against the Harwick Family Trust. The date stamped across the top seized my attention the moment I saw it. It was issued exactly 24 hours before the day Eli vanished, but the transaction details were what sent ice rushing through my veins. A massive cash withdrawal. $250,000 back in the 90s, an almost incomprehensible sum to pull from an account in a single move in untraceable bills without any prior arrangement. I dragged my finger down the page toward the signature line at the bottom. My heart was slamming so hard inside my chest, I genuinely thought I might go down right there on that cafe floor. I had spent thousands of nights holding Miriam while she wept herself hollow over our lost child. I had funded her therapy, her retreats, every avenue she chased in her search for peace. Now, staring at the broad, sweeping loops of the cursive signature at the bottom of that page, a nausea hit me so deep and so sudden I could barely keep it down. I recognized that handwriting. I had seen it on checks, on anniversary cards, on mortgage papers across more than 40 years of marriage. It was Miriam Harwick's signature, my wife's. The room seemed to compress around me. The air inside the cafe thickened until it felt unbreathable. My lungs simply would not open. Why would Miriam withdraw $250,000 in untraceable cash the day before our son was stolen from us? The question detonated in my skull, dragging behind it implications too horrifying to hold steady. The stranger rose to his feet, looming over the table. He zipped his jacket and looked down at me without a flicker of sympathy. "You have 48 hours to get my $2 million Conrad," he said, his voice quiet and absolute. "Or the rest of this folder goes to the press, and your perfect little family gets ripped to shreds." He turned and walked out, swallowed up by the heavy Philadelphia rain. I did not move. I sat there staring at my wife's signature on that old withdrawal slip, utterly immobilized. The grief I had carried for 30 years was being swallowed by something far colder and darker. The possibility that the person responsible for taking my son had not been a stranger at all. That whoever did it might have been sharing my home, my table, my bed. I steered my Mercedes through the slick downtown Philadelphia streets, the tires cutting through standing water on the asphalt. My hands were locked around the leather wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Every red light hit me like a physical impact. The document lying on the passenger seat felt less like paper and more like a live charge burning through the seat cushion. $250,000. $250,000 in untraceable cash, drawn straight out of our family trust. The date on that slip was a ghost clawing its way up from the ground. It was the day before our child disappeared. My mind tore back through decades of memory, trying to force this grotesque new piece into the picture I had constructed of a grieving, fragile wife I had done everything to protect. I turned onto the winding, tree-lined streets of Rittenhouse Square. Rain ran in sheets across the grand facades of the historic houses, but none of it registered. I pulled through the gate and into my private driveway. It was a $12 million fortress of stone and wrought iron, a place I had acquired specifically to make my family feel untouchable. I had invested in top-tier security, reinforced gates, private patrols around the clock. I had dedicated myself to ensuring no one could ever reach the people I loved again. Now, standing outside my own front doors, I felt as though I were walking into an ambush. I killed the engine and sat for a long, heavy moment in the silence. Then I grabbed the manila folder, pressed it against my chest, and stepped out into the freezing rain. The front door swung open onto warmth. The house smelled faintly of expensive cedar candles and braised onions. From somewhere deep down the arched hallway, classical music drifted out of the kitchen, and beneath it, the light chime of glassware. And laughter. A soft, easy laugh. Miriam's laugh. She was speaking to someone, her voice entirely loose and untroubled. The sound of her contentment clenched my gut into a fist. For 30 years I had treated her as though she might shatter. I had kept the press away from her, absorbed the police interviews myself. Constructed a buffer between her and every sharp edge the world had to offer. Because I believed the kidnapping had broken something fundamental inside her. I walked the hallway, my wet shoes pressing dark prints into the polished hardwood. I pushed through into the kitchen. The room was a monument to imported Italian marble and bespoke lighting built on the back of my late nights and relentless work. Miriam stood at the wide central island, a crystal glass of red wine in her hand. She had on a cashmere wrap and her favorite gold chain necklace. Beside her, leaning against the counter in his tailored suit with a glass of bourbon, was Garrett, every inch the polished, commanding CFO I had spent years building him to be. Both of them stopped mid-sentence the moment I entered. Miriam turned toward me, a warm, perfectly composed smile settling across her face. "You are home early, dear," she said smoothly. "The weather out there is absolutely dreadful. Garrett just stopped by to drop off the quarterly reports." I said nothing. I did not acknowledge Garrett. I did not remove my soaking coat. I crossed directly to the marble island. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately, the silence thickening around the change in my bearing. I raised my hand and brought the bank record down hard on the pristine marble surface. The crack of it rang through the kitchen like a shot. Miriam flinched. Garrett went rigid, his eyes snapping to the document. "Look at it," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a fury I had never once let her see. Miriam let out a small, uncertain laugh. She leaned in toward the island and looked down at the plastic sleeve. I kept my eyes fixed on her face. I watched for the precise moment her gaze found the date and the amount. I watched the recognition travel through her. Every drop of color fled her face in an instant. She went ashen, as though something vital had been drained clean out of her. The crystal wine glass slipped from her grip. It struck the marble floor and exploded into a scatter of sharp fragments. The deep red wine fanned out across the pale stone like a spreading wound. Miriam lurched backward, both hands flying up to cover her mouth. A horrible, strangled gasp escaped her, and then the hyperventilating began. Her chest seized and shuddered. Her knees buckled and she slid down against the custom cabinetry, every trace of her composed, polished exterior disintegrating into raw, undisguised terror. I made no move to steady her. I did not reach for her. For the first time across our 45 years of marriage, I looked at my wife and felt nothing but pure, unfiltered revulsion. "I want an answer, Miriam," I said, my voice cutting clean through her gasping, hysterical sobs. "I want to know why you went to the bank 30 years ago. I want to know why you quietly drained $250,000 in cash from our trust fund. And I want to know why you did it exactly 24 hours before our son disappeared." Miriam could not form words. She only shook her head in frantic, wild repetition, tearing at her hair, her eyes blown wide with a cornered animal panic. Her mouth kept opening, but nothing came out except choked, airless sounds. She was performing, trying to be the fragile, shattered woman I was always supposed to run to and shield. I stepped forward, the broken glass grinding under my shoes. "Did you pay someone?" I demanded, my voice climbing. "Did you hire someone to take him? Did you owe a debt to someone? Tell me the truth, right now." She let out a wail, high and piercing, scraping against the inside of my skull. I was finished with patience. I was done with the role of gentle, accommodating husband. I reached down to take hold of her arm, to pull her upright, and make her look directly at me. But before my fingers even grazed her sleeve, a hand seized my shoulder from behind with startling force. I was shoved back. I stumbled, catching the edge of the island to keep my footing. I straightened and looked up. It was Garrett. He had planted himself squarely between his mother and me. His jaw was set, his shoulders drawn back. He stood over me with an expression that pulled the air straight out of my lungs. It was not rage. It was not disbelief. It was pity, cold, deliberate, deeply condescending pity. "Dad, stop," Garrett said, his voice rock steady. There was none of the shock a son ought to feel watching a document surface that tied his mother to his brother's disappearance. He did not glance back at the bank record. He did not ask what it contained. He already knew. He rested a protective hand on Miriam's shaking shoulder and kept his eyes locked on mine. "Just stop, Dad." He repeated it in the same tone, smooth, almost soothing, the way you might speak to someone who has lost their grip on reality. "You are scaring her. You are taking things completely out of context. Out of context. I shot back my hand, cutting toward the paper on the counter. She pulled enough cash to purchase a house the day before Eli was kidnapped. What possible context makes that acceptable? Garrett exhaled a long, theatrical sigh, heavy with the burden of a man about to reveal a painful secret. He looked at me with that same nauseating pity, shaking his head in slow, measured strokes. "She did not want you to know," he said quietly. "She paid the ransom, Dad." Those words hung in the air like smoke. The kitchen fell completely silent apart from Miriam's muffled weeping from the floor. I stared at my son, trying to absorb what he had just said. My mind slammed into a wall. "What are you talking about?" I breathed, the fury faltering for just a moment. Garrett moved forward, filling the room with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms. "The kidnappers reached out to her first," he said, his voice entirely unruffled. "They called the house one day before the police were ever involved. They demanded $250,000. They told her that if she brought you in with your temper, your need to hold the reins on everything, they would kill Eli on the spot. So she went to the bank. She pulled the cash together. She made the drop to save his life." He glanced down at Miriam, then back at me. "And they took the money and never returned him. She has carried that guilt for 30 years, Dad. She buried it to protect you from the weight of it." I looked at Miriam, still crumpled and sobbing on the floor. I looked at Garrett, composed, masterful, perfectly calibrated. It was a flawless excuse. It leaned on my temper, on her frigidity, on the open wound of the tragedy. It was a plausible, airtight lie engineered to shut every question down in a single breath. But standing there, staring into my son's eyes, 4 decades of dismantling opponents across negotiating tables told me everything I needed to know. The faint release of tension in his shoulders, the nearly invisible curl of satisfaction hiding at the edge of his mouth, the fact that his pulse had not moved an inch. He was lying. They were both lying directly to my face. My own family was sheltering something monstrous, and I had just declared war without saying a word. I stood there in my magnificent kitchen, surrounded by the finest materials money could procure, and felt more completely betrayed than at any point in my life. Outside, rain continued hammering the tall estate windows, throwing long, dark shapes across the marble floor. I looked down at the bank receipt on the counter. The teller's stamp had faded to a pale blue, but everything it implied was sharp and merciless. Garrett expected me to crumble. He expected me to drop to my knees, beg forgiveness for reopening old wounds, and fold myself around my weeping wife. He had me cast as a worn-out old man, willing to swallow a tidy tragedy rather than wrestle with a complicated, ugly truth. But I had not raised a billion-dollar logistics empire by accepting convenient explanations. I had built it by catching the small inconsistencies that everyone else let slide past. And right now, the most glaring inconsistency was standing directly in front of me. Why did Garrett, who was no more than 8 years old at the time of the kidnapping, possess precise knowledge of a secret ransom handoff? And why did his eyes carry that particular brand of coldness? I drew a slow, measured breath and let the clarity of that realization settle over me. I let my face soften deliberately. I allowed my posture to sag, performing the exact defeated figure they were expecting. I gave a slow, hollow nod, releasing a long, broken exhale. I moved around. Garrett lowered myself beside Miriam and wrapped both arms around her shaking shoulders. I murmured apologies close to her ear, told her I was deeply sorry for bringing it all back up. But as I held my sobbing wife, my eyes found Garrett's across the top of her head. The war had started without a sound, and I intended to dismantle every one of them. Garrett kept himself positioned solidly between me and Miriam, a living barrier against whatever came next. He exhaled another heavy, theatrical breath, shaking his head, under the weight of a man burdened by responsibility. He crossed to the stainless steel refrigerator, took out a crystal tumbler, and filled it with cold water from the dispenser. Every movement was measured and deliberate, projecting an unshakable calm that stood in stark contrast to Miriam's frantic sobbing on the marble floor. He crouched beside her and pressed the cold glass into her trembling hands. "Drink this, Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying through the taut silence of the kitchen. "You need to breathe. Just take it slow." Miriam choked back a sob, gripping the glass so hard I half expected it to give way between her palms. She took a small, ragged sip, her chest still lurching with each panicked breath. Garrett rose to his feet, smoothing the front of his jacket in a single, practiced motion. He turned to face me, his expression settling into a mask of weary, practiced patience. "You want the truth, Dad?" he asked, his voice quiet and composed. "You want to know what actually happened to that money? Fine. I will tell you because she cannot bring herself to say the words." I stood with my arms folded across my chest and said nothing, waiting for the performance to unfold. My son held my gaze without flinching, not a tremor of hesitation behind his eyes. 30 years ago, Garrett said, beginning a slow, measured pace across the kitchen floor. The day before the police were ever notified, Mom received a phone call at the house. "You were at the office, as you always were, closing another enormous shipping deal. You were unreachable, under pressure, and volatile." The man on the other end of the line told her they had Eli. He told her that if she breathed one word to the authorities, or to you, they would hurt him. They wanted $250,000 in untraceable cash. They gave her exactly 12 hours to put it together. I listened without expression, keeping my face a blank wall. Miriam let out another piercing wail from the floor, pressing her face into her hands. "She was terrified of you, Dad." Garrett pressed on, his voice soaked in righteous indignation. "She knew exactly how you could explode. She knew that the moment you heard about a ransom demand, you would have seized control of everything. You would have mobilized your security team. You would have brought in the police. You would have converted the whole situation into a military operation, and the kidnappers would have panicked and run." She was a desperate, frightened mother doing everything within her power to get her innocent child back from a nightmare. So she made a decision. She went to the bank the very next morning. She pulled the money exactly as they instructed her to. She drove to a designated drop point at the edge of the city and left the briefcase where they told her to leave it, praying they would honor their word and send her son home. Garrett stopped pacing and positioned himself directly in front of me, leaning in just slightly to drive his next words home. "But they took the cash, Dad. They took the money, and they never brought Eli back. The following day you noticed he was gone from the yard, the police were called, and everything spiraled from there." She was too ashamed, too completely shattered by what she saw as her own failure to ever confess what she had done. She has carried the weight of that failed ransom drop every single day for 30 years, and here you are standing over her like she is a suspect. Miriam pulled herself up from the floor, leaning hard against the island for support. Her mascara had run in dark streaks down her face, and her cashmere wrap was stained with spilled wine. She threw herself at me, locking her arms around my waist and sinking to her knees at my feet. "I am so sorry, Conrad," she wailed, pressing her face into my coat. "I am so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. I just wanted my baby back. I thought if I paid them, they would let him go. Please forgive me. It was just foolish, motherly desperation. I was so frightened of what you would do. I did not want him to die because of your pride. Please, you have to believe me." Her tears soaked through the fabric of my trousers. The entire performance was a nauseating spectacle. From the kitchen doorway, a third voice cut through the charged, heavy air. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Conrad. I turned my head. Sandra, my daughter-in-law, was leaning against the doorframe dressed in a silk robe, absently filing her nails, as though this entire scene were little more than a minor disruption to her evening. "You are terrorizing your own wife over a scam artist's fake document," Sandra said, rolling her eyes. "Do you have any idea how absurd you look right now? Some grifter from a coffee shop hands you a piece of paper, and you come charging in here acting like a tyrant, tearing apart a woman who has already lost a child. You really ought to be ashamed of yourself, Conrad. Grow up." I looked at Sandra, absorbed her arrogance, her complete contempt, then looked back down at the weeping woman wrapped around my legs. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to peel Miriam away, to hammer my questions until the truth cracked through. But a man who has spent decades winning in business knows when to play a losing hand and wait. I exhaled slowly, letting my shoulders fall. I reached down and drew Miriam gently up from the floor. I pulled her shaking frame close against me and ran my hand through her hair, murmuring soft, careful apologies. "I am sorry, Miriam," I said quietly, making sure the brokenness in my voice sounded entirely convincing. "I am so sorry. You are right. I should not have come at you like that. The document just blindsided me completely. I know you were only trying to protect our boy. Please forgive me." As Miriam wept against my chest, fingers twisted into my jacket, I opened my eyes and looked over the top of her head. Garrett stood a few feet back, watching the reconciliation play out. For just a fraction of a second, the protective mask he had been wearing slipped entirely. He caught my gaze, then his eyes cut sideways toward the doorway where Sandra stood. He gave her a quick, barely there smirk. It was a flash of absolute triumph, the expression of a predator who had just watched his trap snap shut. That tiny, arrogant slip told me everything I needed. 4 decades of ruthless corporate instinct roared inside my skull. I knew with complete certainty they were both lying to my face. The ransom story was a precisely constructed fabrication engineered to disarm me and bury whatever they were actually hiding. They had concealed something deeply corrupt, and I was going to dig it all the way to the surface. That evening, the grand house in Rittenhouse Square sank into a thick, suffocating quiet. Miriam retreated to the master bedroom early, claiming a migraine, carrying a glass of water and her prescribed sedatives. I performed the role of dutiful, chastened husband without a flaw. I eased her into bed, drew the heavy duvet up over her trembling shoulders, and switched off the lamps. I lay there in the dark, without moving, tracking the slow rhythm of her breathing as the medication pulled her down into sleep. The hours crept past. Rain continued driving against the bedroom windows in a relentless drumming rhythm that matched the hammering inside my chest. When the glowing numbers on the bedside clock rolled to 2:00 in the morning, I finally moved. I eased myself out from under the covers without a sound. I did not bother with a robe or slippers. The cold, hardwood floor pressed against the soles of my bare feet as I moved through the darkened corridors of the estate. Every shadow felt like a taunt. Every expensive fixture a monument to the empire I had built for people who were gutting me alive. I skipped the main staircase and took the private elevator to the secluded wing where my study sat. This room was my sanctuary, heavily soundproofed, strictly off-limits to everyone, including Miriam and the household staff. I locked the heavy oak door and drew the velvet blinds shut, dropping the room into complete darkness before reaching beneath the mahogany desk. I bypassed the modern laptop resting on the surface and pressed a concealed panel near the floorboard. A hidden drawer slid open to reveal an older, heavily encrypted terminal I kept deliberately air-gapped from the main corporate network. As a man who constructed a global logistics network from the ground up, I never discarded foundational data. This terminal held the unalterable financial archives of the Harwick Family Trust, all the way back to the earliest days of my fortune. I powered the machine on. The cooling fan's low hum felt enormous in the sealed silence of the room. The monitor blinked to life, throwing a harsh, pale blue wash across my face. My fingers settled over the keyboard. 3 separate security protocols and a biometric prompt stood between me and the database, but eventually the system opened. My hands were completely steady now. The shock from the coffee shop had burned itself out entirely, leaving something far colder in its place, a clinical, surgical precision. I moved through decades of financial history, scrolling past real estate acquisitions, major shipping contracts, and charitable donations. I narrowed the parameters to the spring of 1995 and entered the exact date stamped on the withdrawal slip the stranger had laid across the cafe table. The system ran the query lines of green text cascading down the dark screen. And there it was, the $250,000 transaction. Miriam had not been wrong about the amount, and she had not been wrong about the date. But as I studied the digital entry, something caught me. I was a man who moved thousands of shipping containers across the globe every day. I understood tracking. I understood the kind of footprint that money always leaves behind. Garrett had constructed a compelling story in that kitchen. He had painted the image of a terrified mother pulling $250,000 in untraceable paper bills to leave in a dumpster on some ordinary street. It was a devastating cinematic portrait of desperation. But what was glowing on the screen told an entirely different story. The transaction code beside the amount was not the code for a physical cash withdrawal. It was a wire transfer code. My chest locked. You cannot wire cash to an anonymous kidnapper. Wire transfers require routing numbers, international SWIFT codes, and registered receiving entities. I tapped the keyboard and expanded the transaction record to reveal where the funds had actually gone. The screen flickered as it loaded the archived banking route. The $250,000 had been electronically funneled through 3 separate intermediary banks before landing in an offshore corporate account based in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary name attached to that account was not a person. It was a shell company. I leaned toward the monitor and read the name aloud in the silent room. Apex Holdings. The air went out of me. The entire ransom drop story was a complete fabrication. Miriam had not left cash in a dumpster for any kidnapper. She had wired a massive sum to a ghost corporation. The level of calculation required to execute that kind of financial maneuver was completely irreconcilable with the image of a panicked, grief-stricken mother acting on pure instinct. I sat there staring at the name Apex Holdings, letting the full weight of it settle over me. But then something began nagging at the far edge of my mind. The name of that shell company felt strangely familiar. Not from decades ago, the recognition was recent. Something glimpsed in passing buried inside the endless quarterly spreadsheets that crossed my desk. I rolled my chair over to the modern laptop on the desk surface. I opened it and pulled up the active financial servers of my logistics empire. My fingers were barely steady as I typed Apex Holdings into the global vendor search field and pressed enter. The system paused for a fraction of a second, combing through our vast international network of partners, suppliers, and contracted consultants. Then the results filled the screen. I stopped breathing. The page was dense with hundreds of line items. Apex Holdings was not a dormant relic from 1995. It was a current, actively compensated vendor sitting inside our corporate ecosystem right now. I clicked the most recent fiscal year and sorted by payment. Every month on the 15th, a scheduled wire of $50,000 moved from our central operating account directly into Apex Holdings. I scrolled back through the prior year, the identical pattern, $50,000 lower month after month. I pushed the search back a full decade, For 10 consecutive years, my company had been steadily hemorrhaging funds to the exact same offshore shell company that had received the supposed ransom payment the day before my son disappeared. I moved my cursor to the authorization column. I had to see whose digital signature was approving these enormous recurring transfers. My gut already had the answer, but watching the name appear officially on the ledger felt like a blade being driven slowly between my ribs. The authorizing officer on every single transaction across the past decade was Garrett Harwick, my son, my chief financial officer. The man I had been grooming to inherit everything I had built was methodically funneling a fortune to the same entity connected to his own brother's disappearance. Garrett was not shielding his mother from an old mistake. He was actively paying someone off at this very moment. The dark room tilted around me. My own son was deeply and inextricably tangled in the worst horror of my life, and he was bankrolling it with the money I had spent a lifetime earning. The sun came up over Philadelphia the next morning in a pale, cheerless gray that gave nothing. I had not closed my eyes for a single minute. I had spent what remained of the night sitting motionless in my study, the glow of the terminal, the only light in the room. Every time I blinked, I saw the offshore routing codes. Every breath I drew felt compressed under the full mass of the betrayal pressing down on my chest. But when the clock reached 6, I stood up. I walked to my private bathroom, ran freezing water over my face, and dressed in my sharpest midnight blue suit. A man does not walk onto a battlefield looking like a casualty. He walks on looking like he already owns the outcome. I drove to the corporate headquarters of Harwick Logistics, a soaring tower of glass and steel anchored in the financial district, built from a single delivery truck and 3 decades of brutal work. When I pushed through the revolving doors into the broad marble lobby, I carried the same bearing I had maintained for 40 years. I acknowledged the security team. I exchanged a word with the receptionists. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it to the top floor, projecting every outward sign of a man whose affairs were in complete order. Behind that face, my mind was running calculations at full speed. I needed to get in front of Garrett. I needed to look directly into his eyes with the knowledge of Apex Holdings sitting behind mine. When the elevator opened onto the executive floor, the thick carpet absorbed my footsteps entirely. I moved past the mahogany-paneled conference rooms toward the West Wing where Garrett operated as my CFO. His assistant was not at her desk off fetching his morning coffee, most likely. As I neared his heavy oak door, I realized I needed a pretext for arriving unannounced. I reached into my breast pocket, produced my reading glasses, and slipped them into the inner lining of my jacket. I would tell him I had left them behind during yesterday's meeting. A harmless, forgettable detail, exactly the kind of thing an older man might say. I raised my hand to push the door open and stopped. It was already ajar by a fraction of an inch, and voices were coming through the gap. Not just Garrett. Sandra was in there with him. That alone was unusual. My daughter-in-law found the corporate offices tedious and well beneath the level of life she preferred to inhabit. I pressed my back flat against the wall beside the doorframe, completely out of their sight line, and listened. "You should have seen him," Garrett was saying, his voice loose and almost entertained the voice of someone retelling a mildly amusing story at a dinner party. The old man swallowed the ransom story whole. He spent 10 minutes on the floor apologizing to Mom for upsetting her. I closed my eyes. The casual cruelty threaded through my son's voice landed like a blow to the sternum. Sandra released a sharp, clipped sigh. "Thank God for that. I thought your mother was going to unravel the entire thing. When she dropped that wine glass, I was certain she was going to confess on the spot. She is so dangerously weak, Garrett. She is a liability. If Conrad had pressed her for even 2 more minutes, she would have fallen apart." "Mom is a mess," Garrett replied, smoothly unbothered. The sound of ice shifting in a glass rang across the room. But she will hold together. She has to. She is far too frightened of losing her position to ever speak the truth. She understands that I am the only thing standing between her and a prison cell. I pressed my palm flat against the cold wall to anchor myself. The marble was ice beneath my hand, but my blood was running at a full boil. Prison. What could Miriam have done 30 years ago that carried a prison sentence? Paying a ransom did not land a grieving mother in front of a judge. So what exactly had she been part of? So what is the next move? Sandra demanded, her voice sharpened with impatience. Because I am not spending another month in that enormous house pretending to care about his feelings. Yesterday was far too close. What happens if that scammer tries to make contact again? Declan is not going to approach him again, Garrett said firmly, speaking the name I had never heard before. Declan. The man in the coffee shop had a name. I already wired Declan his extra consulting fee through the offshore account. He knows how this works. He collects his monthly payment, keeps quiet, and stays well clear of Philadelphia. Yesterday was a warning shot because his payment ran 2 days late. I handled it. The pieces crashed together in my mind with the force of a collision. Garrett knew the man from the coffee shop. Garrett was the one paying him. My own son had been using my company's money to manage the extortion of my own family. You need to close this out, Garrett, Sandra said, the sharp click of her heels crossing his office floor beneath her words. We have been waiting for years. I am done waiting. When does he officially hand over the reins? Next month. Garrett answered, his tone shifting into something that carried pure, uncut arrogance. The board convenes on the 15th. Dad has already executed the succession paperwork. He is transferring the chief executive title and his voting shares to me. We just need to keep Declan paid until that signature is finalized. The moment I hold the company, everything changes. Oh, and what about Conrad? Sandra asked. He is not going to retreat quietly and take up gardening. He is too much of a control animal. I held completely still, waiting for my son's answer, waiting to hear what the boy I had raised and loved and given everything to had decided to do with his aging father. I have already spoken with a specialist, Garrett said, his voice stripped of every last trace of warmth. After the transfer, we begin laying the groundwork. We document the outbursts. We build a record around his fixation on a 30-year-old kidnapping. We construct a medical file that points toward severe cognitive decline, early onset dementia, paranoia. By the end of the year, I will hold medical power of attorney. We will move Dad quietly into a high-end memory care facility in rural Connecticut. He will be out of reach. Mom stays under my control. And we take complete possession of the empire. The air left my lungs completely. The corridor around me seemed to elongate and distort. My son was not merely concealing a decades-old horror. He was actively, deliberately engineering the destruction of his own father. He was bankrolling the man who had tormented me in that coffee shop. And he was methodically orchestrating my medical imprisonment in a psychiatric facility, erasing my freedom, my faculties, and every enterprise I had ever built. For a long moment, I stood frozen outside the oak door. I thought about the decades I'd spent sacrificing my own peace of mind, assembling a fortune vast enough to shield them all. I thought about the sleepless nights I'd agonized over my missing boy's fate, while my eldest son quietly bled my accounts dry to keep the truth buried. Then something inside me broke beyond repair. The profound, crushing sadness that had governed my life for 30 years simply ceased to exist. The grief evaporated. The confusion burned clean away. What rushed in to fill the void was a cold, deliberate, and absolute fury flooding my veins like ice water. It was a pure, uncut rage that swept my mind clear and honed my senses to a razor's edge. Garrett believed he was handling a clueless, heartbroken old man. He thought I was a brittle relic, someone who could be steered with a few staged tears and a convincing enough story. He had fundamentally forgotten who he was dealing with. He had forgotten that long before I was a grieving father, I was a predator in the boardroom. I had dismantled men 10 times sharper and far more ruthless than him. I stepped back from that door without making a sound. I didn't barge in. I didn't raise my voice. Confronting him in that moment would only tell him he'd been caught. I needed him to believe his plan was unfolding without a hitch. I needed him to feel entirely secure right up until the moment I tore his world down to its foundation. I turned and moved back down the plush carpet of the executive hallway, face set in stone, already prepared to dismantle the very family I had spent my life protecting. They would come to regret the day they crossed me. I pushed open the heavy oak door, making certain my hand trembled against the brass handle. I let my shoulders cave forward, taking on the sagging posture of an exhausted old man. I stumbled slightly, crossing the threshold of Garrett's office, dragging my feet along the carpet. I raised my left hand and clutched the fabric of my jacket tightly over my chest. I forced my breathing shallow and uneven, letting out a faint, strained gasp. Garrett was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, eyes moving across a spreadsheet. He glanced up, his expression flashing briefly with irritation at the unannounced intrusion before he smoothed it over with a look of dutiful concern. He stood abruptly, pushing back his leather chair. "Dad," he said, his voice threaded with manufactured worry. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" I leaned against a leather guest chair and let out a long, slow exhale. I pressed 2 fingers to my temple, shutting my eyes as though fighting off a wave of dizziness. "I just need a moment," I whispered, letting my voice crack at precisely the right point. "My heart is racing, Garrett. It feels like a snare drum in my chest. I can't seem to catch my breath." Garrett came around the desk, placing a steadying hand on my back. He guided me down into the chair, playing the role of the devoted, frightened son with surprising polish. He poured a glass of water and held it out to me. I took it with shaking hands, letting a few drops spill enough to sell it. "Sip it slowly, Dad," he said gently. "Do you need a doctor? Should I call for an ambulance?" I shook my head weakly and took a slow pull from the glass. "No," I rasped, letting my head fall back against the leather upholstery. "It isn't a heart attack. It's the stress. The absolute crushing weight of everything that's happened in the last 24 hours. I opened my eyes and looked at my son, projecting total defeat. "That man in the coffee shop, Garrett," I continued, my voice wavering. "The things he said, the document he showed me, it dragged all the agony of losing Eli back to the surface. I feel like I'm drowning in it again. Seeing that photograph, hearing those lies, it broke something in me. I can't function like this. I can't lead this company when my mind is swallowed whole by ghosts from 30 years ago." I watched his face carefully. Beneath the mask of filial concern, I caught a flicker of hungry anticipation lighting up behind his eyes. I let out another weary sigh. "I spoke with my cardiologist this morning," I said, lying without any effort at all. "He told me my blood pressure is at a dangerous level. He said if I don't disconnect immediately, I'm looking at a massive stroke. I need to get away, Garrett. I need silence and isolation. I'm taking the private jet out to Cape May, 2 weeks at the oceanfront estate, completely off the grid. No calls, no emails, no corporate fires to put out. Just rest." Garrett nodded sympathetically, though his grip on my shoulder tightened with barely contained excitement. You have to listen to your doctor, Dad, he said, voice smooth as polished wood. Your health is what matters. Your mother and I will deal with whatever that extortionist tries next. We'll protect you. I looked up at him and offered a weak, grateful smile. I know you will, son, I murmured. But I need more than that from you. I can't leave the firm without direction for 2 weeks, not right before the close of the fiscal quarter. Effective immediately, you have full operational control of the company. You sign the checks. You approve the contracts. Think of it as a trial run ahead of your promotion next month. The greed that moved across his face was so raw, it was nearly nauseating. He tried to hold back the smile biting the inside of his cheek, but the ambition radiated off him like heat from a furnace. Are you sure, Dad? He asked, feigning hesitation. Completely, I replied, rising slowly to my feet. The company is yours for the next 2 weeks. Don't let me down. I left the corporate headquarters and had my driver take me back to Rittenhouse Square. When I walked into the mansion, I kept up the performance of a broken, ailing patriarch. I found Miriam in the master suite. When I told her about my supposed medical episode and the doctor's strict orders to retreat to Cape May, she moved into action without missing a beat. She was the portrait of a devoted, terrified wife. She hurried to her walk-in closet and began pulling out my finest linen shirts, cashmere sweaters, and tailored trousers, folding them with care into my leather travel bags. "Oh, Conrad," she murmured, her voice trembling with perfectly measured anxiety. "You frightened me so badly yesterday. I can't bear the thought of losing you to a heart attack. You have to rest. I'll stay here and make sure everything at the house runs smoothly. You just focus on breathing the sea air and getting your strength back." I stood in the doorway of the closet and watched her. I looked at the same hands that had signed the withdrawal slip to bury my 4-year-old son. Whatever tears she was shedding now were not for the child she'd discarded. They were for the comfortable life she was fighting to preserve. A wave of revulsion turned in my gut. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand the truth. Instead, I simply stepped forward and pressed my lips gently to her forehead. "Thank you, Miriam," I said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled and patted my chest. "Just get better, my love," she whispered. "Just get better." An hour later, my driver loaded my luggage into the trunk of the town car. As we pulled away, I watched Miriam through the tinted glass. The instant she thought I was beyond sight, her whole bearing changed. The worried tension drained from her shoulders, and the look of concern simply disappeared, replaced by a hollow, cold emptiness. She turned and walked back inside, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. I raised the soundproof partition. I took out my phone and dialed my chief of aviation. "I need a change of flight plan," I said, my voice stripped of every last trace of weakness. "We are not going to Cape May. Reroute the jet immediately. We're flying to Washington." I wasn't seeking rest. I was seeking a weapon. 2 hours later, I walked into an office a few blocks from the federal courthouses. Seated behind a massive desk was Aldous Crane, a ruthless former prosecutor who owed me his entire career. He rose to his feet, reading my face in a single glance. "Conrad," he said evenly, extending his hand. "You look like a man who's preparing for a war." I gripped it. "I'm not preparing for a war, Aldous," I replied. "I'm preparing for an execution." Aldous Crane held court in a conference room that functioned like a sealed fortress. It sat 3 floors below the busy streets of Washington, a subterranean bunker encased entirely in thick, soundproof acoustic paneling and heavily frosted glass. I stood at the head of the massive obsidian table in silence, drawing the fragile contents from my leather briefcase. I spread the printed ledgers from my legacy mainframe across the dark wood, sensitive documents laid out like an old general's maps before a final desperate campaign. I set the faded withdrawal slip directly beside the modern offshore wire transfer codes. Aldous stood close at my shoulder, his sharp, dark eyes moving with intensity across the highlighted columns. He had spent 15 grueling years as a federal prosecutor systematically dismantling organized crime before moving into private practice, and he recognized immediately what he was looking at. He traced the hidden trail of the $50,000 monthly payments, with his silver fountain pen jaw tightening as he connected the dates. He offered no hollow comfort, no performative sympathy. He simply looked at me, fully absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. "Your own son, Conrad." Aldous murmured, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that filled the quiet room. "He's been running a sophisticated extortion operation straight through your primary corporate accounts, bleeding you out right under your nose." I nodded slowly, pressing my weight against the polished edge of the table to steady my legs. "I need to dismantle his entire operation tonight, Aldous," I said, my voice carrying none of the warmth a father's voice should hold. I need his access to my empire severed immediately, and I need to know exactly who this Declan character is. I want every private communication between Garrett and Sandra monitored around the clock. I want to know what they're planning before they've even finished thinking it. Aldous didn't hesitate for a single moment. He crossed directly to the secure intercom panel set into the wall and pressed a silver button with firm deliberation. "Send the specialists in now," he instructed. Less than a minute later, the heavy, reinforced steel door swung open. Two men entered carrying substantial military-grade metallic cases. Aldous introduced them simply as former federal agents specialists in digital forensics and corporate espionage. Men who existed entirely off the grid. Men who knew how to crack a secure digital vault without leaving so much as a fingerprint. I gave them my explicit, unrestricted legal authorization to fully penetrate the Harwick logistics network. I handed over my master administrative credentials, granting them the highest level of access the company possessed. The specialists worked with a methodical speed that was almost unnerving. They rapidly established a secure uplink to my corporate servers and began systematically cutting through the expensive firewalls Garrett mistakenly believed he controlled. Within 30 minutes, they had executed a shadow clone of Garrett's active corporate laptop, mirroring his entire hard drive, capturing every encrypted file, every buried spreadsheet, and every offshore account routing sequence he had hidden away. But they didn't stop there. Using the administrative backdoor I had provided, they moved into the mobile carrier networks and established a real-time intercept on the personal phones of both Garrett and Sandra. Lines of intercepted text messages began scrolling rapidly across the large digital monitor mounted on the conference room wall. I stood in complete silence, reading the venom my son and his wife were casually exchanging between themselves. Garrett had sent Sandra a message just an hour earlier. "The old man is completely isolated in Cape May. His doctor says his heart is failing fast. The board meeting is in 2 weeks. Start looking at brochures for that memory care facility. We need to secure a room in their restricted ward." Sandra had replied almost instantly. "Make sure it's the one with 0 visitation rights. I don't want to deal with his complaints when we sell his ridiculous estate." Reading those words was like swallowing broken glass. But I welcomed the sharp pain. It was feeding the cold mechanical fury that was the only thing keeping me upright. I turned away from the glowing monitor and looked directly at Aldous. "It's time to starve them," I said, my voice cutting through the bunker's silence. "I want a complete, unannounced financial freeze on every trust account, personal liquid asset, and discretionary corporate fund that Garrett currently believes he controls." Aldous nodded at once, pulling a thick stack of legal authorization forms from his desk. We'll construct a phantom trust, he explained, his pen moving rapidly across the documents. I'm going to quietly transfer 80% of your core liquid fortune into a newly formed, completely blind holding company. Garrett will still see the full account balances on his screen, but it will be nothing but a digital mirage. Every cent will be locked down, requiring your physical biometric signature to move so much as $1. He won't realize the money is untouchable until he tries to push through his next major transfer. Nah, there's more, I said, my mind running the numbers on the real estate portfolio. I want you to quietly liquidate the Rittenhouse Square estate, the Winter Lodge in Stowe, and the private aviation fleet. Sell them to anonymous buyers under strict non-disclosure agreements. Keep the leasebacks active for 30 days so nothing raises suspicion. When Garrett tries to seize my physical assets after his little board meeting, he will discover he's trying to claim ownership of properties I no longer hold. I'm going to leave him with nothing but the clothes on his back and the full weight of a federal indictment bearing down on him. Aldous slid the final document across to me. I signed my name with a single heavy stroke, officially releasing the silent financial guillotine. As I passed the pen back, one of the cyber specialists cleared his throat. The sound split the focused quiet of the room like a crack of ice. "Now, Mr. Harwick," the agent said, his gaze fixed on the scrolling code on his secondary monitor. "We just broke through the final layer of offshore encryption on the Cayman Islands account. We have the true ownership registry for Apex Holdings." I moved to his workstation and planted both hands on the desk. "Who is it?" I demanded, my heart hammering hard against my ribs. "Who has been receiving my money?" The agent struck a key. A high-resolution scanned document filled the screen. It was a corporate formation charter from 1995. The name of the registered owner was printed in bold black letters. Gerald Morrow. I stared at the name. The air left my lungs completely. The room began to tilt. Gerald Morrow was not some anonymous kidnapper. He was not a faceless criminal operating from the shadows. Gerald Morrow was the man who had served as the private chauffeur for the Harwick family for over 20 years. He had died exactly a year ago. The arrogant grifter Garrett called Declan was his son, Declan Morrow. The revelation struck me with the force of a freight train. Gerald Morrow. The man had driven my cars, carried my groceries, and smiled at my missing son. He had stood quietly in the periphery of my life for over 2 decades. He'd offered me his solemn condolences when the police suspended the search for Eli. And all that time he was the ghost behind Apex Holdings, the architect of the fake ransom operation, bleeding my empire dry while chauffeuring me to corporate meetings. Now his son, Declan Morrow, had inherited the family enterprise of extorting the Harwicks. I didn't stay in Washington a moment longer than necessary. I instructed Aldous to maintain the financial lockdown and keep the cyber team monitoring every digital move my son made. I boarded my private jet under cover of darkness and flew back to Philadelphia completely off the radar. The flight passed in a blur of icy rage. Using the intercepted data from Garrett's cloned laptop, I pulled the burner phone number my son used to communicate with the blackmailer. I did not involve the police. I did not involve security. This was a cancer that demanded a precise personal excision. Upon landing in Philadelphia, I drove directly to an industrial district near the shipping ports. Among the vast array of properties I held was a decommissioned logistics warehouse sitting vacant at the edge of the harbor. It was a cavernous shell of rusting steel and cracked concrete, a world away from the polished marble of Rittenhouse Square. It was the perfect stage for a reckoning. I settled into the cold, damp office overlooking the warehouse floor and pulled out a fresh, untraceable mobile phone. I sent a single, precise text to Declan. It read, "I know about the $2 million lump sum demand. Garrett is out. I am taking over the payments. Meet me at Pier 82 warehouse in 1 hour. Come alone. I knew from the intercepted messages that Declan was pressing Garrett for a massive $2 million payout to disappear for good. Garrett had been stalling, stringing the grifter along until the corporate takeover was complete. But Declan was impatient and reckless. I was counting on that greed to override his instinct for self-preservation. I unlocked the heavy iron safe in the warehouse office, a relic from my early days managing cash payrolls. I pulled out 10 banded stacks of $100 bills, $100,000 in crisp, sequential currency. I packed the money into a sleek metallic briefcase and snapped the latches shut. The heavy clack rang out across the vast, empty space. I descended the metal stairs to the warehouse floor, the only light a single flood lamp hanging from the high ceiling far above. I set the briefcase on a rusted shipping crate at the center of that pool of light. Then I retreated into the shadows to wait for the ghost of my past to walk through the door. Exactly 50 minutes later, the heavy corrugated metal doors at the front of the warehouse rattled and shook. A black sports car pulled inside its engine, roaring with unnecessary aggression before going silent. The headlights sliced through the dusty air, throwing long, menacing shadows up the walls. The driver's door swung open, and Declan stepped out onto the concrete. He was a tall, powerfully built man in his late 30s, dressed in a tailored leather jacket over a dark t-shirt. He moved with a swaggering, self-satisfied confidence that made my blood run hot. As he walked into the ring of light, I got my first clear look at his face. There was a faint trace of my wife Miriam around the jawline, a calculated resemblance he had learned to exploit. But the arrogant tilt of his chin and the cold measuring quality in his eyes belonged entirely to his father, the chauffeur who had spent 20 years betraying me from the background. Declan surveyed the empty warehouse, a smug grin spreading across his face. He clearly believed every card in the deck was his. He thought he had a frightened, shattered old man pinned inside an inescapable web of family secrets. "Well, well, well!" Declan called out, his voice bouncing off the concrete and steel around us. The great Conrad Harwick stepping down from his ivory tower to do business in the dirt. I'll admit I was surprised when you texted. I figured Garrett would try to keep you insulated from the ugly reality until he had you tucked away in that fancy memory ward. I stepped out of the shadows and moved slowly into the light. I gave his provocation nothing, kept my face entirely still, projecting an aura of absolute quiet control. I came to a stop a few feet from the shipping crate and held his gaze without blinking. "You demanded $2 million from my son," I said, my voice low and level. "You promised that if you received that lump sum, you'd take your fabricated story and vanish for good." Declan chuckled and ran a hand through his hair. "It's not a fabricated story, Conrad, and you know it. Mom paid the ransom, but they never gave me back. It's a genuine tragedy. But I survived, and all I want now is my fair portion of what this family owes me." Garrett agreed to the $2 million. "If you're stepping in for him, I expect the full amount tonight. Otherwise, the press is going to receive a very interesting story about the missing Harwick heir returning from the dead." I reached out and pressed my palm flat on top of the briefcase. I popped both latches with my thumbs, and the lid sprang open, revealing the thick, banded stacks of cash inside. "There is exactly $100,000 in this case," I said, never shifting my eyes from his face. Declan's smug expression faltered just a fraction, just for a second. He glanced down at the money, then back up at me. "That's not $2 million, old man. That's an insult. Are you sure you want to test me?" I didn't blink. I reached into my jacket pocket and produced a sterile, sealed medical tube containing a single cotton swab. I dropped it onto the stacks of cash. "You get the rest of the money when you give me a DNA sample right now," I said, my voice going hard as sharpened steel. You can run your psychological games on Miriam all you like. You can extort Garrett because he's a coward. But I don't accept your story for a single second. I don't accept that you are Eli. Swab your cheek or walk out of here with absolutely nothing. Declan stared down at the medical tube. The heavy silence of the warehouse pressed in around us. Then the arrogant grifter threw his head back and laughed a loud, echoing sound that filled the rafters. He reached down, tore open the plastic packaging, and scraped the swab firmly against the inside of his cheek. He tossed it back onto the cash eyes, bright with dark amusement. "You're a smart man, Conrad," Declan said, closing his hand around the briefcase handle. "Smarter than your wife, anyway." I watched him drive out of the building, then immediately dispatched the fresh swab to a highly private rapid testing laboratory. Waiting for the results felt like pushing through wet concrete. I had moved from the damp warehouse to an anonymous suite overlooking the Schuylkill River. Aldous Crane and his cyber specialists had converted the room into a digital command center. The large windows were blacked out completely. The plush bed was buried under financial ledgers. The focal point was a bank of monitors mounted along one wall, broadcasting a silent live feed from inside my home. Before I had departed for my fabricated retreat, Aldous' operatives had slipped past the perimeter security of my estate. Working under the cover of a routine network upgrade, they had embedded microscopic motion-activated cameras and sensitive audio receivers throughout every primary living space. The kitchen foyer, living room, and master suite were now entirely exposed. I sat in an armchair in the dim suite, eyes fixed on the glowing screens. I was a ghost, haunting my own house. For the first 24 hours, the feeds showed precisely what I expected. The house moved quietly through its days, kept in careful order by the daytime staff. But as the sun went down, and the staff cleared out, the true shape of my wife's inner life came into view. Miriam was unraveling. The careful facade she had maintained so flawlessly in my presence came apart completely the moment she believed I was on a plane to Cape May. I watched her on the monitor covering the main living room. The grand space was lit only by the restless flicker of the stone fireplace. Miriam paced the length of the Persian rug, her movements erratic and uncontrolled. She wore a silk robe that hung loose from her thin frame. In one hand, she gripped a large crystal tumbler filled with dark, amber liquid straight Scotch from my private reserve, and she was drinking it with the desperate urgency of someone trying to drown a fire that wouldn't go out. Her hands trembled so badly the liquor sloshed over the rim of the glass. She drifted to the bay windows and stood staring out into the dark courtyard, muttering to herself in fragments. The audio receivers caught panicked whispers. She was terrified. She kept throwing glances over her shoulder as though something in the room was closing in on her. I sat watching the woman I had shielded for over 4 decades, feeling nothing where my sympathy used to live, just a cold, clean void. She was not a victim. She was a co-conspirator being slowly crushed beneath the weight of her own deception. Near midnight, the motion sensors in the grand foyer lit up green on my panel. The heavy front doors opened. Garrett walked into the entryway, shaking rain from his coat. He moved through the house with the casual, proprietary stride of a man who already considered it his. He found his mother in the living room. Miriam practically folded against the sofa when he appeared, letting out a sharp, ragged gasp. Garrett did not move toward her. He stood near the threshold and studied her with a cold, clinical detachment that had no warmth in it at all. "Pull yourself together, Mom," Garrett said, his voice flat and hard. "You're a mess. The staff is going to start asking questions if they keep finding you wandering around like a drunken ghost every morning." Miriam shook her head in rapid, desperate movements, raising the trembling glass to her lips and taking a long pull. "I can't do this anymore, Garrett." She sobbed, her voice raw and fraying at every edge. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that man. I see the bank receipt. Your father knows something is wrong. He is not a fool. He's sitting up in Cape May right now, but I know his mind is working. He's going to keep digging. He's not digging anywhere. Garrett cut in sharply, pouring himself a small glass of bourbon. He bought the ransom story completely. He's exactly where I want him, isolated and entirely dependent on me to run the company. You just need to hold your nerve for a few more weeks. Miriam lurched forward, her face contorted with raw, naked terror. She seized the lapels of his leather coat, her knuckles draining white. You don't understand, she cried, her voice cracking against the walls of the room. The ransom story won't hold if he looks too closely. If Conrad finds out what really happened that day at the lake, he will kill me. He will absolutely kill me. I stopped breathing. What I am about to share with you changes everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. The weight of it nearly broke me where I stood. Before we get there, if you discovered that someone you loved had been quietly working against you for years, would you walk away? Or would you make sure they faced every consequence? The air in my room turned to ice in an instant. I stared at the monitor, my mind violently recoiling from the words she had just spoken. The lake. For 30 agonizing years, the official narrative of my son's disappearance had been etched into my soul and into every police report on file. Miriam had told the detectives that she had taken 4-year-old Eli to the crowded King of Prussia Mall. She said she had turned her back for no more than 10 seconds to pay for a toy at a kiosk. And when she turned back around, the stroller was empty. He was gone, swallowed by the crowd. The police had combed every corner of that mall and reviewed hours of grainy security footage. The entire investigation had been anchored to a busy commercial center. There had never been a lake. The lake was an entirely different location, an isolated summer cabin we owned miles outside the city, a place we had supposedly not set foot in during the weeks leading up to the kidnapping. Garrett didn't so much as flinch at her words. He forcefully peeled his mother's trembling hands from his coat and pushed her back with a disturbing, effortless calm. He stepped toward her, closing the distance between them, towering over her slight frame. Because you are going to keep your mouth shut, Garrett replied, his voice dropping to a lethal, measured whisper. You are going to smile. You are going to take your pills. And you are going to play the grieving widow without a single mistake. Because if you break Mom, if you say one wrong word to him, I will stop paying Declan. I will let Declan take his evidence straight to the district attorney. And you will spend whatever years you have left inside a federal penitentiary for what you did. Do you understand me? Miriam whimpered and sank down onto the sofa cushions, folding in on herself like a beaten animal. She nodded slowly, pressing her tear-streaked face into her hands. Good. Garrett sneered, turning his back on her. I'm finalizing the corporate transfer paperwork tomorrow. Stay out of my way. He walked out of the room and left his mother weeping alone in the dying light of the fire. I sat frozen in the armchair of my hotel suite, digital audio static, hissing softly from the speakers. My hands had locked onto the armrests. The full magnitude of the deception was almost too vast to hold in my mind at once. My son was not merely a greedy executive skimming corporate funds. He was a ruthless blackmailer actively leveraging the threat of federal prison over his own mother's head to secure his inheritance. But the most devastating revelation of all was that geographical slip, the lake, a single word that had just shattered 30 years of accepted reality. Miriam was the architect of a massive cover-up. I would tear down every layer of it until I found the truth about my son. The morning sun climbed above the Schuylkill River, sending long beams of light into the darkened suite where I had spent the night, watching my family's destruction play out on surveillance monitors. The revelation about the lake still reverberated through me, a toxic secret that had hollowed out the very foundation of everything I thought I knew. Miriam and Garrett had lied about the mall. They had lied about the ransom. They had lied about all of it. I switched off the monitors, and the room fell into absolute silence. The time for watching was finished. The time for answers had come. A sharp knock at the hotel suite door pulled me out of the dark current of my thoughts. I crossed the plush carpet and opened the door. Aldous Crane stood in the hallway, his face unreadable, a thick, sealed manila envelope in his hand. His presence was a cold reminder of the reality waiting for me. I stepped aside and let him in. He moved directly to the small glass dining table and set the envelope down. The rapid testing laboratory completed the analysis an hour ago. Aldous said, his voice entirely without inflection. They worked through the night on a full genetic comparison against the DNA profile from your medical records. The results are definitive, Conrad. There is no margin for error. I stared at the envelope sitting on the glass surface. It felt like a device with a short fuse. For 30 years, some small and buried part of my soul had clung to the impossible hope that my little boy was still alive somewhere out in the world. Even knowing the man in the coffee shop was an arrogant grifter, even knowing he was the son of my dead chauffeur, the physical evidence in that envelope was the final nail in the coffin of that hope. I reached out and picked it up. I broke the seal with my thumb and drew out the single sheet of official laboratory paper. My eyes moved immediately to the bottom of the page, past the dense scientific language searching for the conclusion. The words were stark and entirely without mercy. Probability of paternity, 0%. No shared genetic markers, no biological connection whatsoever. The man who had demanded $2 million from my son, the man currently bleeding my corporate accounts through a phantom offshore company, was absolutely not Eli. He was Declan Morrow. Nothing more than a parasite feeding off the rotting remains of my family's tragedy. I set the paper back on the table. I felt no sorrow. What I felt was a profound, clarifying sense of certainty. The board was fully laid out, and I knew precisely who every player was. I reached into my jacket pocket and produced the untraceable burner phone I had used to reach the extortionist at the warehouse. I dialed the number and put it on speaker so Aldous could follow the conversation. The line rang 3 times before it opened. "Did you bring the rest of the money, old man?" Declan asked, his voice soaked in the same insufferable, swaggering arrogance. Because I'm getting tired of waiting for my payout, I listened to the sound of his breathing and pictured his smug face. "You are not my son," I said, my voice flat and cold, carrying the full weight of absolute certainty. The laboratory results just came back. There is a 0% biological match between us. You are Declan Morrow, the son of Gerald Morrow, my former driver. You used your father's intimate knowledge of this family to build a financial extortion operation. The arrangement is finished. You will not receive another cent from my accounts. I expected panic. I expected denial or an immediate threat to go to the press. Instead, a low, genuinely amused chuckle came through the speaker. It grew into a full laugh, relaxed and entirely unbothered by the exposure of his true identity, echoing in the quiet of the hotel suite. "You really think you've got it all figured out, don't you, Conrad?" Declan laughed, the sound grating against my nerves. "You think you're the sharpest mind in the room because you ran a DNA test. But you're missing the entire point of the game." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my grip tightening around the phone. "I never said I was Eli, old man," Declan replied, his tone shifting into a slow, mocking drawl. "I never claimed to be your missing golden boy. I handed you a piece of paper and a photograph. I told you I was the kid in the picture." That is exactly what I said, nothing more, nothing less. You jumped to your own conclusions because you are desperate. I looked across the table at Aldous, who simply gave a slow, measured shake of his head. The photograph. I recalled the faded image Declan had slid across the cafe table. It showed a small boy clutching a bright red toy fire truck standing in front of a white brick building. An image that had haunted me for days because of its raw, inexplicable familiarity. "Take another look at that picture, Conrad," Declan taunted through the line. "Look closely at the clothes. Tell me what you see. I'll give you a hint, the truth is in the fabric." I ended the call and dropped the burner phone on the table. I tore into my briefcase, pulling through stacks of ledgers and legal documents until I found the manila folder Declan had given me. I drew out the photograph, my hands shaking with a sudden surge of adrenaline. I carried it to the floor-to-ceiling window and held it up to the full light of the morning. I forced myself to look past the emotional shock of that first encounter and study the image with discipline. I examined the small boy and the line of his jaw, the curve of his nose, the set of his dark eyes. It was not Eli. I had been so overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of the toy fire truck and so consumed by the trauma of the moment that I had projected my own son's face onto the child. The boy in the photograph was unmistakably a young Declan Morrow, but then my gaze dropped to the clothing the boy was wearing. My breath caught hard in my throat, snagging on a detail that tore apart whatever remained of my composure. The child in the photograph was dressed in a distinctive bright red winter jacket, custom brass toggles, a very specific dark blue corduroy collar. I knew that jacket. I remembered purchasing it at a boutique in London during a business trip. I had carried it home and given it to Eli on his 4th birthday. It was a completely unique, custom-made garment that no ordinary store had ever stocked. Declan was telling a horrible truth. It was his face in the photograph, but he was wearing my missing son's winter clothes. I stared at that red corduroy collar, the brass toggles blurring as the full horror of what I was seeing washed over me. It was not a ransom photo. It was a trophy. Declan Morrow was wearing the very clothes my son had on the day he disappeared. The implications were too monstrous to absorb fully inside that small hotel room, but the path forward became suddenly brutally clear. I lifted the burner phone from the glass table and dialed the direct line to the head of my private security detail. These were not corporate guards. They were former military operatives I kept on retainer for high-level asset protection, men who worked with complete discretion and devastating precision. I gave my head of security a single directive. I provided the license plate of the black sports car Declan had driven to the warehouse, his full legal name, and his likely locations around the city. I told my team to find him, acquire him quietly, and bring him back to Pier 82 immediately. The methods were their business. The result was mine. Aldous Crane watched me from across the room, reading the dangerous shift in my bearing without a word. I thanked Aldous for the laboratory results and instructed him to press on with the financial strangulation of my son. Then I left the hotel and drove back through the dark streets of Philadelphia toward the industrial waterfront. The rain had resumed slicking the roads, its cold, relentless rhythm matching the one inside my chest. I arrived at the warehouse, unlocked the heavy metal doors, and stepped back into the vast, echoing dark. I threw on the single overhead floodlight and waited. Less than 2 hours later, the grinding of heavy tires on wet concrete announced their arrival. A black tactical vehicle pulled straight into the center of the warehouse. The rear doors slid open, and 2 of my operatives climbed out, hauling a thrashing, furious Declan Morrow between them. His wrists were zip-tied behind his back. His tailored leather jacket was torn at the shoulder, and every trace of his swaggering arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by the wide-eyed, frantic panic of a cornered animal. They shoved him hard into a metal folding chair directly beneath the harsh glare of the floodlight. My men stepped back and dissolved into the shadows near the exits, sealing off any route out. I walked slowly into the light, my footsteps ringing off the concrete floor. Declan strained against his restraint's chest, heaving, glaring up at me. Are you insane?" Declan shouted, his voice cracking with fear and fury. "You can't just snatch people off the street. I'll call the police. I'll have you locked up for the rest of your miserable life." I did not raise my voice. I showed him nothing. I pulled a thick black dossier from my briefcase and brought it down heavily on the rusted shipping crate in front of him. "You're not going to call anyone, Declan," I said, using his real name, deliberately watching the color drain instantly from his face. "Yes, I know exactly who you are. You are Gerald Morrow's son. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I know about Apex Holdings. I know about the $50,000 monthly transfers my son Garrett has been wiring you for the past decade. And I know you are wearing my dead son's winter jacket in that photograph." Declan stopped struggling. The bravado left his face as if a switch had been thrown. I leaned forward, planting my hands on the crate, bringing my face close to his. "Here is the reality of your situation." I continued, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "I have a team of former federal prosecutors and cyber specialists who have documented every wire fraud and extortion demand you have ever made. You have moved millions of dollars across international borders. That is a federal offense, carrying a mandatory minimum that will ensure you die in a concrete cell. I am going to hand this entire dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in exactly 5 minutes, unless you tell me precisely what your father did to my son." Declan swallowed hard. The silence in the warehouse was absolute, broken only by rain hammering the tin roof above us. He looked at the dossier. He looked at the cold, unyielding faces of my security team waiting in the dark. He finally understood that the old man he thought he'd been playing had quietly engineered his complete destruction. That realization broke him. Please," Declan gasped, his voice shaking apart. "Please, you have to understand. None of this was my plan. It was my father. He built the whole operation before he died. He left me the offshore accounts and detailed instructions on how to keep the pressure on Garrett. He told me it was my inheritance. I drew a pocket knife and sliced cleanly through the zip ties at his wrists. I don't care about your inheritance," I said, stepping back. "I want the truth. What did Gerald do?" Declan rubbed his raw wrists, hands trembling, and reached into the inner pocket of his torn jacket. He produced a small, faded, leather-bound book and set it carefully on the metal crate, sliding it toward me. It was a handwritten journal. "That's my father's diary," Declan whispered, his eyes cutting nervously toward the exits. "He put everything in there, every payout, every lie, every meeting. When he got sick last year, he gave it to me. He told me the Harwick family owed us this money for what he'd done for them. He called it hazard pay payment for carrying their darkest secret to his grave." I stared at the worn leather cover. It looked like an ordinary, unremarkable notebook, yet it sat on that rusted crate with a heavy, sickening gravity. I let my fingers rest on the rough binding. "You need to read it," Declan said, his voice dropping to something urgent and raw. "Because you have that completely wrong, Conrad. You think my father was a kidnapper. You think he stole your boy and sent a ransom demand, but that is not what actually happened." I opened the cover slowly. The pages were filled with Gerald's cramped, precise handwriting, dates, times, detailed accounts of private conversations involving my wife. I scanned the ink, forcing my mind to process what my eyes were reading. Declan rose from the chair and took a careful step back into the shadows, looking at me with a mingling of pity and dread. Your wife did not pay my father a fake ransom 30 years ago, Declan said. The words hung in the freezing, damp air of the warehouse like a death sentence. She did not drop that money in a dumpster to bring her little boy home from strangers. She paid my father to conceal a dead body and stage an elaborate kidnapping. I stared at Declan Morrow. The air in the warehouse thickened around me, close and suffocating. Conceal a dead body. The words carved through my chest with the clean precision of a surgical instrument echoing in the cold, cavernous space. I looked down at the faded, leather-bound journal on the rusted crate. The hands that had remained perfectly steady while dismantling corporate empires now trembled as I turned back the cover. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in the neat, meticulous cursive of a man who had spent his entire life keeping to strict schedules and logging mileage. I moved past the mundane daily entries, eyes searching for the dates surrounding that cursed weekend in October 30th years ago. I found the page marked with a heavy, underlined heading. It read, "The Lake House." I began to read. With every sentence, the entire foundation of my existence crumbled to dust. Gerald Morrow had not written a bare confession. He had composed a vivid, excruciating autopsy of my marriage and of the death of my only son. 30 years ago, while I was in London navigating a high-stakes corporate merger, Miriam was not resting at the Rittenhouse Square estate as she had claimed. According to the meticulous entries left by my loyal chauffeur, Miriam had been engaged in a reckless, passionate affair with a local country club tennis instructor. She had packed up our 4-year-old son, Eli, and driven him to our remote summer cabin at the lake, a property buried deep in dense pine forest, miles from any neighbor or prying eye. The journal laid out the events of that Saturday afternoon with a sickening clarity. Miriam had invited her lover to the cabin. While they occupied the master bedroom, my wife had left our 4-year-old child entirely unsupervised. Guaranteeing her privacy meant pouring vodka glass after generous glass, a secret addiction she'd buried from me across years of marriage. Gerald's diary laid out what happened next. She let Eli drift unattended through the back door, across the sloping lawn, all the way down to the wooden dock, hanging over the lake's cold, black depths. Miriam lost herself entirely in the hours that followed. Time dissolved. Only after her lover slipped away did she lurch out onto the back porch and go looking for her son. What she found stopped the world. Eli was face down in the water near the dock's edge, his tiny body snarled in the dark weeds below the surface. Gone. My 4-year-old, beautiful, blameless beloved had drowned alone in that freezing lake because his mother chose vodka and adultery over him. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat. My eyes clamped shut against a surge of nausea so violent it threatened to drop me where I stood, and yet the journal's horrors were nowhere near finished. Gerald set down in careful detail the panicked, shrieking phone call Miriam placed to him that same night. Not to emergency services, not to the county sheriff, not to me an ocean away in London, to her driver. Her loyal, discreet driver. Miriam was consumed by terror, but grief for Eli had nothing to do with it. What paralyzed her was the arithmetic of consequence. Police on the property would find her drunk, a lover's tire tracks pressed into the gravel, and a dead child in the water. Criminal negligence charges would follow. I'd end the marriage within hours, and she'd walk away with nothing, no money, no reputation, no place in the gilded world she'd built her entire identity around. So she made Gerald Morrow an offer designed to erase her catastrophe. $250,000 cash, untraceable, in exchange for making the problem disappear. Gerald took it. He steered the company town car out to the lake cabin once the night was deep enough to hide him. Tucked inside the diary was something that turned my blood cold, a rough hand-drawn map marking a thick stand of birch trees sitting precisely 3 miles beyond the northern property line. Gerald wrote about retrieving a shovel from the maintenance shed, opening the earth in that damp, lightless grove, and putting my son in the ground. He described it almost mechanically, a task completed, while Miriam stood on the cabin porch in the warmth of the doorway, a fresh drink shaking in her grip, watching another man enter her child without producing a single honest tear. I clenched the metal table's rim, my lungs pulling at air that didn't seem to reach them. The Pier 82 warehouse felt as though its walls were folding inward. My gaze lifted to Declan, motionless in the shadows across from me, studying my face as the full weight of his father's written confession settled onto my chest. "Keep reading," Declan said quietly, the sneer he'd worn earlier completely gone from his voice. "You need to see how they engineered it. Every detail of how your devoted wife turned you into her biggest fool." I dragged my eyes back to the page. Gerald had recorded the logic behind the cover-up with cold precision. A drowned child would trigger one kind of investigation, one that led straight back to the lake house, and put Miriam at the center of it. A vanished child was something else entirely. It made her a victim, someone the public would grieve alongside. The scheme required a stage. The morning after Gerald drove Miriam back to Philadelphia, Declan came along. Gerald's son was nearly a match for Eli in both age and size, close enough for what they needed. Gerald retrieved the bright red winter jacket with the distinct blue corduroy collar, the one I'd carried home from London, and dressed Declan in it. He tugged the hood forward until the boy's face was gone. Then they headed for the King of Prussia Mall. Gerald's instructions to Declan were simple: move fast. Head down, push through the crowd toward the back of the building. Miriam, meanwhile, took her place beside the central fountain and waited. The instant Declan pushed past the jewelry kiosks, a bright red shape cutting through the shoppers, Miriam threw her head back and screamed. She jabbed her finger at the fleeing figure, wailing that her child was being taken. The entire mall came apart at the seams. Guards sealed every exit. Shoppers scattered in every direction, and police flooded the building. In the middle of it all, Gerald calmly collected Declan at the rear door, peeled off the red jacket, and disappeared into traffic. Miriam sank to the mall's marble floor in a performance of maternal devastation so convincing it became the defining tragedy of our lives. She constructed a lie so thorough, so carefully engineered, that it became the architecture of my existence for the next 3 decades. I set the journal down my fingers, bloodless and cold. The kidnapping, our family's defining wound, the story that had shaped everything, was theater. Stagecraft. She had killed my son through neglect and sealed him in the earth with her money, and now the child she kept was leveraging that buried crime to drain everything I'd ever made. Garrett had known the truth all along, and he'd picked the cash over doing right by his brother. The diary went into my coat pocket. Grief had run its course. What came next was something harder and colder: retribution, long overdue, and now inevitable. The warehouse air felt thick, almost solid, as though it were pressing directly against my chest. Nausea surged through me in a long, clenching wave, knotting my stomach until I couldn't stand straight. I staggered back and found the rusted corner of a shipping crate behind me, dropping onto it hard, both hands pressed flat against my sternum. My heart was throwing itself at my ribs in a wild, stuttering rhythm, trying to push blood through what felt like frozen pipes. When I closed my eyes, the black behind them wasn't merciful. It played back every image the diary had forced into my mind. For 30 agonizing years, I had been mourning a boy who was already in the ground when I started looking. All those nights flat on my back, staring at the ceiling, building a face for the stranger who'd walked out of that mall with my son, a stranger who didn't exist. The private investigators, the multi-million-dollar rewards, the dead-end trails followed across a dozen countries. The times I'd pulled Miriam close while she wept, the two of us wrapped in the same grief, or so I believed. I never once suspected that the person I was hunting had been pressed against my shoulder the whole time, weeping on cue, while somewhere in rural Connecticut our boy lay in an unmarked hole in the dark. I opened my eyes and steadied myself against the table, the journal's yellowed pages still spread beneath my hands. Every instinct told me to tear it apart, but the truth inside it was too important to destroy before I'd absorbed every word. I pressed my palms flat to stop the shaking, dragged a sleeve across my forehead, and turned to the next page. I was braced for more of Gerald Morrow's accounting of his own crimes. What I found instead was a different hand. The dates had vaulted forward 2 full decades. These entries were written in fresher ink, the penmanship tighter, more urgent. Gerald had opened a second ledger of corruption, and this one drove the blade somewhere far more personal. Exactly 10 years ago, Garrett had been prowling through Gerald's rooms above the carriage house. Garrett was 28 years old. Gerald was laid up in a hospital bed, recovering from a mild heart attack. My eldest son, the entitled, arrogant prince he had always been, claimed he was hunting for a missing set of keys to a vintage sports car. What he found instead was the lockbox, the journal inside. The same pages I'd just finished reading. Garrett now knew exactly what had happened to Eli, and exactly what his mother had done to cover it up. As his father, I clung to one desperate hope, that the shock of it had cracked him open. That my eldest son had gone straight to Miriam, detonated the truth in her face, and walked her to the authorities to give Eli what he'd never received. But Gerald's handwriting, frantic strokes across the page, the pen pressing harder as the fear mounted, dismantled the last illusion I had left. Garrett never went near a police station. He didn't grieve for his brother, not for a single moment. He looked at what he held in his hands and recognized it for what it was, the most powerful instrument he would ever own. Gerald described their confrontation that afternoon in precise, terrified detail. Garrett didn't dangle prison over the old man's head. He sat across from him with the diary open between them and proposed new terms pleasantly, as though they were renegotiating a contract. Then he crossed the house to Miriam's private sitting room. He set the journal in her lap without a word and watched the blood leave her face. He watched her, the woman who had raised him, fold into herself, shaking and weeping on the cushion, and he felt nothing. No mercy, no revulsion. Only the clean, quiet pleasure of leverage recognized and seized. He laid out his terms, her secret would stay buried, and Gerald Morrow would be kept comfortable and silent for whatever years he had left. The price for that silence, however, was staggering. At the time, Miriam held 30% of the voting shares in Harwick Logistics, a commanding block of ownership I had placed in her name early in our marriage. Garrett's demand was non-negotiable hand over total control of those voting shares quietly and immediately. He wanted unchallenged dominance inside the boardroom, the machinery to push me aside piece by piece, and eventually occupy the chief executive chair without a whisper of opposition. Miriam, staring down the twin barrels of losing everything she'd built and facing a murder charge, put her signature on the documents without pause. She traded her dead child's right to justice to protect herself, and in doing so, she placed my empire in the hands of a sociopath. Gerald's entries described how Garrett took over the extortion payments with something close to pride, but greed wouldn't allow him to reach into his own accounts. He engineered an intricate web of offshore vehicles instead, siphoning the hush money straight out of my corporate discretionary funds beneath the cover of Apex Holdings. He was buying silence with my own money, the money that paid the man who put my murdered son in the ground. When Gerald died, Garrett transferred the arrangement seamlessly to Declan, keeping the secret locked airtight while he went on consolidating the power he'd stolen. He had sold his little brother's justice for a corner office. I sat motionless in that dim, freezing warehouse, the silence pressing in on my ears. The chest pain that had seized me began to bleed away, and what replaced it was something I barely recognized. 3 decades of suffocating grief, the weight that had defined every waking hour of my existence, simply burned off. What took its place was white-hot and absolute. Understanding that my entire family was a den of vipers, that the people wearing my name and eating at my table were ruthless, calculating monsters, scoured away the last of whatever softness remained in me. The grieving father was gone. The betrayed husband was gone. What sat in that warehouse now was something else entirely, a mechanism built for pure, unadulterated vengeance. I closed the worn leather journal with deliberate care, feeling the aged texture of its cover beneath my fingers. I pressed it flat against my chest inside the inner pocket of my suit jacket. Then I looked down at Declan Morrow, still folded into that metal chair, watching me with the eyes of a man who understood his fate had already been written. My operatives held their positions in the dark, motionless, waiting on a word from me. I gave him nothing. Not a syllable. The grifter was no longer a factor in what was coming, simply a loose thread already accounted for. I drew out my encrypted phone and dialed. The connection opened at once, the secured line carrying nothing but a faint, steady hum through the silence of the warehouse. "Aldous," I said, my voice traveling through that vast, empty space with a calm that could have stopped a clock. "I have the full picture now. The ransom was theater from the start. Miriam killed him. Gerald put him in the ground. And Garrett has been running the cover-up for a decade to take what's mine." A weighted silence followed on the other end of the line. Aldous Crane, a man who had witnessed the lowest depths of human cruelty, taking a moment to absorb the sheer scale of it. "What do you need from me, Conrad?" He asked it the way a surgeon asks for a scalpel, precise, unhurried, ready. I moved toward the warehouse's heavy metal doors, each footstep striking the concrete floor with the steady rhythm of a countdown. I pushed out into the cold and the driving rain, letting it hit my face without flinching, feeling only the iron certainty of what was already in motion. "It's time for the slaughter," I said evenly, and cut the call. I pocketed the phone and gave my detail the signal to lock down the building behind me. The rain drummed against the car roof as my driver carried me back toward the airfield. I boarded in silence and told the pilot to take us back to Philadelphia. The fiction of my medical retreat had to hold a little longer. During the flight, I rehearsed the performance. Shoulders curved inward, breath kept shallow, and labored the authentic vacancy of exhaustion settled into my face like a mask I'd learned to wear. By the time the car passed through the estate gates, I looked every inch the man death was already courting. The heavy oak door opened before I reached it. I crossed the marble foyer slowly, one hand pressed to my chest and trembling on cue. Miriam was waiting at the foot of the grand staircase, performing the devoted and terrified wife with the same practiced ease she brought to everything she'd ever deceived me with. She came forward quickly, folding her arms around me, her face pressed against my shoulder. "Oh, Conrad," she breathed, her voice threaded with manufactured worry. "You look so pale. You shouldn't have come back this soon. The doctor said you needed complete isolation." I gave her a weak smile and let my hand settle gently on her arm. "I feel much better, Miriam." I let my voice carry a slight tremor as the lie slipped out. The time away helped clear my head. I realized I can't keep running from what's inevitable. This company needs steady leadership at the helm. Garrett descended the stairs with Sandra a half-step behind him. The look on his face was triumph, working hard to pass itself off as concern. "Dad," Garrett said, dropping a patronizing hand onto my shoulder. "You belong in a hospital bed, not a boardroom." I gave him a slow nod and let my weight sag against the banister. "You're not wrong, son," I said, barely above a whisper, projecting total collapse. That's precisely why I came home early. I've reached my final decision. I'm stepping down. As of tomorrow morning, you are the chief executive officer of this company. The greed that blazed across Garrett's face was almost too raw to look at directly. Sandra dug her fingers into his arm, her eyes alight with a victory she'd been waiting for. To mark the occasion properly, I continued, my voice rasping as though each word cost something. I want the four of us to sit down together tonight, a formal dinner in the grand dining room. We owe it to this moment to observe it the right way. Miriam swept into motion, immediately directing the household staff toward a lavish spread with breathless enthusiasm, utterly blind to the executioner, who had just walked calmly through her front door and taken his seat at the head of the table. 3 hours later, the grand dining room was dressed for the performance. The mahogany table gleamed beneath the light of glowing brass lanterns set with our finest crystal. I sat at the head and watched the monsters eat. Sandra was to my right, wearing a stunning deep burgundy evening gown. Around her throat hung a necklace of flawless diamond stones I recognized at once. Garrett had authorized their purchase last month from corporate discretionary funds buried inside a fabricated foreign vendor acquisition. She touched them repeatedly, almost compulsively, wearing the stolen wealth like a declaration. Miriam sat to my left, performing maternal tenderness with the quiet precision of a seasoned actress. She was cutting my roasted rack of lamb into small pieces, as though I'd lost the use of my hands entirely. "Eat slowly, Conrad," she said softly, tilting a measure of red wine into my crystal glass. "You need to build your strength back before the transition." I watched those hands with an intensity I kept completely off my face. Those were the hands that had pressed $250,000 in cash into a chauffeur's grip to put my murdered 4-year-old in an unmarked hole in the cold ground. Every ounce of discipline I possessed went into keeping my fingers flat on the tablecloth. Vengeance that means anything cannot afford impatience. I brought the wine glass to my lips and took a measured sip. When the dessert plates had been cleared away by the staff, Garrett rose from his chair at the far end of the table, glass in hand. He struck the crystal with a silver spoon, the note ringing clean and sharp through the room. Miriam and Sandra turned toward him, their faces soft with adoration and the unguarded glow of anticipated wealth. "I'd like to say something." Garrett began, his voice carrying the full weight of a man who believed the kingdom was finally his. "To my father Conrad, for 40 years you built something extraordinary from nothing. You poured your health, your energy, your entire self into giving this family a life most people can't even imagine. That is something none of us will ever stop honoring." He stepped out from behind his chair and walked the length of the table in deliberate silence, commanding the room the way he'd always imagined himself doing. When his eyes found mine, they carried a hypocrisy so profound it could have choked me. "Stepping into the leadership of Harwick Logistics is the greatest thing I will ever be asked to do," he announced, lifting his glass. "I give you my word, Dad, that I will defend everything this family stands for. I will protect what we've built. I will guard the legacy that bears our name. And I will make certain this family holds its power for generations yet to come. To family, to everything we've built together." Miriam and Sandra raised their glasses without hesitation, aged single malt whiskey catching the brass lantern light as they chimed in together. "To family and to our legacy," they drank, smiling at one another across the candlelit table. I did not lift my glass. I sat without moving, both hands resting open on the polished mahogany. The dying patriarch dissolved. I brought my spine straight and pulled my shoulders back to their full width. The shallow, labored breathing ceased. What replaced it was slow and deep and deliberate. The shift in my posture was so sudden and complete that the smiles died on their faces where they sat. Garrett set his glass down, a furrow cutting across his brow. "Dad," he said, the arrogance in his voice beginning to slip. "Is something wrong?" I rose from my chair without hurrying, coming to my full height. I looked at Miriam. First, her hand had begun to shake, red wine trembling against the rim of her glass. Then at Sandra, whose fingers had flown instinctively to the stolen diamonds at her throat. Then I turned my gaze to Garrett and left it there. He shifted back half a step. Whatever he read in my stillness told him something lethal had entered the room. I lifted my crystal glass of red wine and held it in the air between us. The smile I gave them was cold enough to frost the windows. "That was a genuinely beautiful speech, Garrett," I said, my voice moving through the room with a dark, unhurried resonance. "You covered everything: family sacrifice, the sanctity of our name. Remarkable truly how cleanly you can lie while drinking my aged single malt whiskey." I watched the color leave his face. On the subject of legacy, I went on, reaching unhurriedly into the breast pocket of my jacket. "I brought something for the occasion tonight, a bedtime story from 1995. I drew out the worn journal and brought it down onto the center of the dining table. The impact rang through the polished mahogany like a gavel. I slid the chauffeur's diary across the table and let it come to rest directly in front of Miriam's trembling hands. "Let's have an honest conversation about what happened at the lake, my dear." Miriam's eyes fell on the small, battered book. Recognition moved across her face and was swallowed immediately by naked terror. The crystal wine glass slid from her fingers and exploded against the china plate, dark red blooming across the white tablecloth like an open wound. A sound came out of her guttural animal, the shriek of a woman watching her fabricated existence crumble beneath her feet. She went down onto the hardwood floor, hands clutching at her evening gown, pulling air into her lungs as though the room had flooded. Garrett didn't freeze. His instinct for self-preservation kicked in before the shock had even finished landing. He understood immediately what that diary meant for his freedom. With a desperate feral sound, he shoved his dining chair backward and threw himself across the width of the table. Silverware crashed around him as he reached for the leather-bound journal. He never got within arm's reach of it. The oak doors to the adjoining hallway swung open, and 4 men in black tactical suits stepped into the dining room, the operatives I had dispatched from the Pier 82 warehouse, moving with total silence and the kind of precision that leaves no room for argument. Before Garrett's hands could reach the diary, 2 of them were on him. They seized his shoulders and pulled him backward with enough force to rattle his spine, driving him hard into the wallpapered wall and locking his arms behind him with practiced, merciless efficiency. The sound of his body hitting the plaster cut through his mother's hysterical weeping like a gunshot. Sandra flew up from her chair, color gone from her face, both hands clutching the diamond necklace at her throat. "Conrad, what is this?" she cried, staring at her husband pinned against the wall. "What are you doing to him?" I didn't look at her. My eyes stayed on Garrett, who was struggling without result against the grip of my security team. "I haven't lost my mind, Sandra," I said, my voice carrying that same flat, dangerous calm. "For the first time in 30 years, I've recovered it." I drew my encrypted phone from my pocket and tapped the screen, once pulling up the audio file my cyber team had captured earlier that evening. I set the phone beside the diary and pressed play. Garrett and Miriam's private conversation filled the dining room through the small speaker. Miriam's voice came first, panicked, fractured. "If Conrad ever finds out what really happened that day at the lake, he will kill me." Then Garrett's response, ice cold and deliberate, "He won't. Because you are going to keep your mouth shut, or I will stop paying Declan, and you will spend your final years locked in a federal penitentiary." The recording ended. The room held its breath, broken only by Miriam's ragged gasping from the floor. Sandra stood rigid, staring at her husband in horror, edging slowly away from the table. I walked around the mahogany table and came to a stop directly in front of Garrett. "You traded your dead little brother's justice for a corner office and a counterfeit sense of power," I said, and my voice carried the quiet devastation of something that can't be undone. "I know everything, Garrett. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I know about Apex Holdings. I know about the $50,000 monthly transfers you authorized to keep Declan Morrow quiet. I know precisely how you drained my corporate funds to underwrite your extortion arrangement while sitting across from me at this very table and talking about protecting our legacy." Garrett pulled against the operatives, holding him, sweat breaking across his forehead. "Dad, listen to me," he said, the arrogance finally fracturing under the weight of what he couldn't escape. I stepped closer and cut him off. "I know your mother drove my 4-year-old son to the lake cabin 30 years ago to be with her lover. I know she was drunk, and I know she let him drown in that freezing water alone. I know she handed Gerald Morrow $250,000 to put his tiny body in the ground, like something disposable, all to protect her standing in polite society." I dropped my voice until it was barely more than a blade against his ear. "And I know, courtesy of Gerald's meticulous records, the exact GPS coordinates of the birch grove, where my son's remains have been lying in the cold earth for 3 decades. The FBI is securing that location right now." Miriam let out a wail from the floor, curling into herself. Garrett's eyes went wide. The moment he understood that federal authorities were already in motion, it landed on him like something physical. His chest heaved as he cast around for any exit that wasn't there. He fell back on the only instinct he'd ever really trusted. "Dad, stop. Please." The cadence of Garrett's voice shifted into the rapid, pressured rhythm of negotiation. "We can contain this. We can keep it internal. Think about the empire. Think about the market share. If a murder cover-up and federal embezzlement charges hit the press, the stock goes into freefall the same morning. It'll be a massacre on the trading floor. You'll lose hundreds of millions overnight. Everything you spent your life constructing gets leveled. I can help you manage the damage. Just pull the federal agents back." I stood without moving and let his desperation spend itself against me. He genuinely believed the prospect of financial ruin would give me pause. He believed I weighed profit margins against the memory of a murdered child. The last trace of whatever fatherly feeling I might have carried for him dissolved completely in that moment, leaving only a cold, settled satisfaction. I gave him a slow smile. Not the performance from earlier, this one was real, and there was nothing warm inside it. A predator looking at what's already broken. "You've badly misjudged me, Garrett," I said quietly, with the finality of a man who has already closed the door. "I have no interest in Harwick Logistics anymore. Stock prices, market share, the board of directors, none of it." I reached into my pocket and produced a single folded sheet of heavy legal paper. "I sold my entire controlling block of shares to a rival private equity firm exactly 48 hours ago," I said, watching what remained of his hope extinguish behind his eyes. "The transaction is legally finalized. The proceeds have cleared into an irrevocable blind trust. When the market opens Monday morning, news of your arrest will obliterate whatever stock value is left, leaving you your board and everything you stole with nothing but worthless certificates and catastrophic debt. So I dismantled my own empire specifically to ensure there is nothing left for you to take. The company doesn't matter to me anymore, son. You are the only thing I came back to destroy." Miriam stared at the diary on the table as though it were alive and venomous. The 30-year illusion she had tended and perfected cracked apart beyond any repair. She opened her mouth and produced nothing but a hollow gasp. She scrambled backward across the floor, her gown twisting around her legs, unable to find purchase on the hardwood. Garrett remained pinned against the wall, my operatives holding him fast, his face stripped of everything except raw terror. The full scope of his miscalculation had finally reached him. He had walked into this room believing he was the apex predator. He had forgotten entirely who built the jungle he was standing in. Into the heavy silence came a new sound. From somewhere out in the distance, a faint wail threading through the wet streets of Rittenhouse Square. Within seconds, it multiplied, swelling in volume and urgency, until the police sirens merged into a deafening roar as an enormous law enforcement convoy bore down on the estate. Red and blue lights strobed through the rain-slicked windows, throwing frantic shadows across the walls and ceiling. Garrett squeezed his eyes shut. Miriam pressed both palms over her ears and folded herself into a ball on the floor, whimpering as the certainty of imprisonment collapsed on top of her. The heavy oak front doors didn't swing open. They were thrown back with a concussive crash that reverberated through the entire foyer. Tactical boots struck the marble in hard, rhythmic succession. My security operatives drew back into the shadows without a sound. Aldous Crane came through the dining room doorway first. My attorney moved with sharp composure in his dark suit, his expression telling nothing. He carried a thick leather briefcase, a coffin for their futures. Behind Aldous came a solid formation of federal agents in dark windbreakers flanked by local homicide detectives who wore the grim certainty of men who already knew how this ended. The room filled with crackling radios and the cold metallic sound of handcuffs. Aldous moved forward and stopped near the shattered wine glass. "Conrad," Aldous said, his voice calm. "The perimeter is fully secured. The federal warrants have been executed. The forensic excavation team has reached the coordinates in the woods. They will find the boy tonight." I gave a single nod, my face an unreadable stone wall. I looked at my wife, the woman who had bartered our son's life for a seat at the right dinner tables. A homicide detective stepped around the table and pulled Miriam to her feet without ceremony. She was sobbing in heaving waves, mascara streaking her face, her gown destroyed. "Miriam Harwick." The detective announced, his authority absolute. "You are under arrest for the involuntary manslaughter of Eli Harwick. You are charged with severe obstruction of justice, filing a false police report, and concealment of a human corpse. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Miriam twisted against his grip and begged the room for help, but the handcuffs closed around her wrists with a sharp metallic snap. That sound echoed off every surface the precise moment her reign of deception reached its end. Across the room, 2 federal agents moved toward Garrett. He didn't fight them. The greedy prince of Harwick Logistics had nothing left in him. His shoulders caved as they drew his arms behind his back. "Garrett Harwick," the lead agent said, reading from a document. "You are under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand extortion. Furthermore, you are charged as an accessory after the fact to a homicide. The combined mandatory minimum for these offenses guarantees you will spend the remainder of your life in a federal penitentiary." Garrett looked at me as the steel closed around his wrists. His eyes were a plea for mercy he had never once extended to anyone else. He opened his mouth, another negotiation forming, but the handcuffs answered for me. Sandra stood rigid near the edge of the table, watching the ruin of everything she thought she owned. The diamonds at her throat, which had gleamed so triumphantly an hour ago, now looked like a noose. As the agents prepared to march her husband out, something inside her finally gave way. A wail broke from her tears, cutting through the careful architecture of her face. She lurched toward me, hands pressed together in desperation. "Conrad, what is this?" Sandra cried, her voice splintering. "What are you doing? What is going to happen to us? What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? You can't leave me with nothing." I looked at her and felt nothing except a cold, absolute disgust. This woman had spent freely from money extracted out of my murdered son's burial site. She had luxuriated in the stolen proceeds without a moment's curiosity about where they came from. I turned toward her slightly and spoke in a voice so stripped of warmth it seemed to drop the room temperature. "You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your counterfeit designer bags and vacate this property permanently." I said, each word measured and deliberate. "Do not attempt to remove anything of real value. My security staff will observe your departure. Every credit card bearing your name has already been canceled. Your bank accounts are frozen. The vehicles have been impounded." Sandra's hand shot to her legs threatening to buckle. "But I have nothing," she wept. "I have nowhere to go." I held her gaze, my expression offering not a single splinter of sympathy. "Welcome to the real world, Sandra," I replied. "I'd move quickly if I were you. The storm outside is not improving." I turned my back on her, weeping, and walked toward the large bay windows that faced the grand circular driveway. Rain fell in relentless heavy sheets across the pale stone below. I stood without moving, a still figure in a house that was already hollowing itself out around me. Through the rain-blurred glass, I watched the federal agents bring Miriam and Garrett down the wide front steps. They were moved without gentleness into the back seats of waiting cruisers. The red and blue lights washed over their pale, beaten faces one last time before the car doors slammed shut and sealed their fate. The convoy pulled away slowly, sirens carrying into the dark and stormy night, taking with it every person who had stolen pieces of my life. Silence reclaimed the house, deep encompassing, wrapping itself around me like something I hadn't felt in years. I stayed at the window, hands at my sides. For 30 years, I had carried a suffocating, unresolved weight of grief and guilt that never once let go. It was gone now. I looked out into the dark and felt something I could only describe as peace, genuine and deep, finally moving into the spaces that weight had occupied. The empire I'd spent a lifetime constructing was gone, dispersed in a controlled sale. My marriage had been a grotesque and bloody fiction from nearly the beginning. My remaining son was bound for a concrete cell. But watching the taillights of those cruisers dissolve into the Philadelphia night, I understood that none of those losses carried any real weight against what had just been done. Justice had come for my little boy. The account was settled. The nightmare at last was finished. 6 months passed after that stormy night. The legal proceedings that followed were swift, extensively covered, and without mercy. The press descended on Philadelphia in force, ravenous for every sordid thread of the Harwick family's collapse. I didn't retreat from the cameras or the reporters who staked out the courthouse steps. I stood in those echoing courtrooms and watched with cold detachment as the full bloody tapestry of what my wife and son had done was spread before the world. Miriam's trial ran less than 2 weeks. Confronted with the weight of Gerald Morrow's detailed journal and the audio recordings, her defense team counseled her to take a plea. She stood before the federal judge, a pale, shrunken version of the commanding socialite she had spent decades performing, and wept openly as she confessed to the involuntary manslaughter of our 4-year-old son. She admitted to the obstruction of justice, the false police reports, and the unthinkable concealment of a child's body in the earth. The judge extended no leniency whatsoever. 25 years in a maximum security facility, where her social rank and her curated reputation counted for absolutely nothing. Garrett fought his charges with the cornered ferocity of a man who still believed money could buy an exit. But the private equity firm had already broken apart his corporate structure, and without my wealth insulating him from accountability, his legal team walked away. He was convicted without much difficulty on all counts: massive corporate embezzlement, grand extortion, wire fraud, and acting as an accessory after the fact to a homicide. He stood in his midnight blue suit, jaw locked in disbelief, as the judge delivered a mandatory minimum sentence of 40 years with no possibility of parole. Both of them were stripped of the stolen wealth, the hollow titles, and the freedom they never deserved. I never went to see either of them behind those walls. I never read their letters begging for a response. They ceased to hold any place in my reality. The single event during those 6 months of legal proceedings that truly mattered was the recovery of my boy. The federal excavation team, guided by the precise GPS coordinates preserved in the chauffeur's diary, located the shallow grave in the dense birch grove exactly 3 miles north of the lake cabin. The forensic anthropologists worked with careful, unhurried precision for 3 days, treating the cold, damp ground with a reverence that Miriam had denied him in life. When the lead detective rang my secure line to tell me they had recovered Eli's remains, I didn't break down. Instead, a profound, quiet serenity settled over my weary spirit. We brought him back to Philadelphia in a small, beautifully crafted mahogany casket. I arranged a private burial on a quiet, rolling green hill above the broad sweep of the Atlantic. There were no performative crowds, no hollow socialites, and no theatrical tears. Just me, a handful of fiercely loyal men from my personal security detail, and the steady rhythm of ocean waves breaking against the distant rocky shore. The sky above was a clean, brilliant blue without a single cloud. I ordered a simple, elegant gray granite headstone to mark his final resting place. It bears his name, his true dates of birth and passing, and one inscription pressed into the stone in gold lettering: "Finally found, forever loved." Today, a crisp autumn wind carries a sharp, biting chill as I stand entirely alone beside Eli's quiet grave. The brittle golden leaves drift down from the tall oaks overhead, settling across the cropped grass in a mosaic of amber and deep crimson. I reach out slowly, my leather-gloved fingers brushing the cold, smooth face of the granite. I am an old and tired man, now standing quietly in the fading twilight of my years. No deceitful wife beside me, no treacherous son behind me, no vast corporate empire left to define who I am. By every conventional measure the world uses to keep score, I have lost everything a man can lose. And yet, as I stand here drawing in the cold, salt air, I arrive at a truth that took 30 years to reach me. For the very first time in those 30 long, agonizing years, the crushing, suffocating weight that lived inside my chest has completely disappeared. The phantom pain of the unknown, the endless, torturous nights spent wondering whether my little boy was cold or hungry or crying out for his father, somewhere in the dark, all of it has gone permanently silent. The grand, bloody illusion of my family has been reduced to a smoldering pile of ash where it once stood. But in the hollow space it left behind, I hold the one singular thing my limitless money was never able to purchase. I finally have the complete and undeniable truth, and the truth, no matter how brutal, how bloody, how devastating its form, delivers a peace that nothing in this world can shake. I am entirely alone, but I am no longer wandering blindly in the dark. When the sale of the Harwick logistics empire to the private equity firm was settled, I found myself in possession of a remaining personal liquid fortune of exactly $100 million. A staggering, almost incomprehensible figure. But that accumulated wealth had been hollowed of all meaning to my soul. It could not reach back and rewrite the tragic past. It could not pull my innocent son from the freezing, suffocating water of that remote lake. Yet, as I spent my quiet, solitary evenings gazing out over the glittering lights of the Philadelphia harbor, I came to understand precisely what that immense sum could do for others, for desperate people with nowhere else to turn. I established the Eli Harwick Foundation. I bypassed every slow-moving bureaucratic channel entirely and focused on immediate aggressive action on the ground. I used the entirety of the $100 million personal endowment to fully fund EquipTrain and deploy elite private investigation teams across the entire country. These are highly specialized units built from former federal agents, gifted cybersecurity experts, and experienced tactical military operatives. Their singular, relentless mission is to deliver world-class, uncompromising investigative work completely free of charge to low-income families searching for their missing children. We pursue children whose families cannot afford a private detective. We search for the vulnerable ones who are ignored by underfunded, overworked local police departments. We fight for the heartbroken parents condemned to live inside the exact same agonizing, terrifying nightmare I endured across 3 long, dark decades. In the past 4 months, my operatives have safely brought home 16 missing children, placing them back into the arms of the desperate parents who never stopped looking. Every time my phone rings with a successful recovery report, I walk to my window and look out at the vast ocean. I think about the boy in the red jacket who never got to grow up. I think about the terrible secrets that festered for decades in the shadows of my own home. I could not protect my son from the monsters who hid in plain sight beneath my roof. But through this work, I am protecting the sons and daughters of others. I took the darkest pain a human heart can be made to bear and forged it into a beacon of salvation for those who need it most. The greatest tragedy in life is not being deceived by strangers. It is discovering that the monsters you have always feared are the very people sleeping under your roof. We blind ourselves willingly to the failures of those we love, persuading ourselves that blood ties and marriage vows are a guarantee of loyalty. But true loyalty is written in what people actually do, not in the titles they hold. Money can purchase silence. It has never once purchased peace. When you finally stop making excuses for the toxic people in your life and demand the truth instead, it will devastate you. But that devastation is the price you must pay to take back your life, your dignity, and your absolute freedom. Music. I used to ride upon your shoulders thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river. Years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's son. And every step I take and every time I choose to stand, when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lives within, like an echo calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, "Child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter." Every step I take and every time I choose to stand, when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. Although the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints. One day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold, not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me. The stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly, I am my Father's daughter. If you have stayed with me this far, then you already understand that some stories do not end, they transform. This one transformed me completely. I spent 30 years mourning a lie. I held a woman while she wept for a child she had let drown. I shook my son's hand across a boardroom table while he used my own money to keep that secret buried. The cost of trusting the wrong people was not measured in dollars, it was measured in decades. I believe God does not allow the truth to stay buried forever. What Gerald's diary held in that lockbox for 30 years eventually found its way into my hands, and every person who thought they had escaped justice discovered otherwise. That timing was not luck. Here is what I want you to take from Conrad's story. First, loyalty is proved by conduct, not by family title. Blood is not a contract. Watch what people do when you are not in the room. Second, if something about the official story has never sat right with you, trust that instinct. Silence and comfort are not the same thing as truth. Third, when you finally demand the truth from the people hiding it, be prepared. But demand it anyway. The pain of knowing is always less than the slow ruin of not knowing. Fourth, do not let grief become a cage. Conrad took the worst thing that ever happened to him and built something with it that gave 16 other children back to their families. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, someone carrying a weight they haven't been able to name. And if you haven't already subscribed to Dad Revenge so you never miss a story like this one, thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.